Walter Bagehot and the American Civil War. Walter Bagehot was born into a wealthy banking family at the dawn of Victorian England and would go on to become a successful banker as well as author and editor of The Economist magazine. Considered by those who work at the publication today as the greatest to hold the position, his stint as editor lasted from 1861 until his death at the age of 51 in 1877. He is credited with taking The Economist from a publication focused on a narrower, laissez-faire demographic to being a paragon for Gladstonian liberalism. Within the English Constitution, Walter Bagehot had an astronomical contribution to economics and politics, where he highlights how civilizations maintain them. He argues how cultures tend to oppose the worth of modern liberalism because they are upheld by conformism through military success, ideas that he pushes in The Economist. In his January 1861 article, The Bearing of American Disunion, he talks about his negative outlook on the American Civil War and how it threatened the nation's economic stability. He stressed that the secession of the South would be detrimental for their economy, and that even with a Southern victory, the reopening of the slave trade would not work, as the rest of the Atlantic had already abolished slavery by that point. But beyond slavery, Bagehot points out that they will lose power, for after all, power must lie where there is a preponderance of money, population, harmony, and homogeneousness, and all these the North has and the South has not. Here he is saying that a nation needs more than just a common fondness of slavery. It needs morals, money, and a sense of nationhood. Furthermore, the comparison of the North and South would be just too damning for the South on a global stage. As he writes, in conclusion, and this is perhaps the most fearful feature of the whole, what will be of the moral and social condition of the Southern states when liberated from even the faint control over their barbarism? Here, Bagehot tells us that the act of slavery would not be able to uphold against the North's freedom, which all works into his agenda of supporting fiscally responsible democratic republics. That was the support of his agenda, but let's move on to how he viewed the North and South in comparison with how Americans did. He favored the North for their economic and moral high ground and criticizes the South extensively, essentially stating that the claim for secession boiled down to sore feelings over losing the election of 1860. He's quick to point out that the South would still remain an equality in the House of Congress and a decided majority in the other. In fact, a virtual command over all legislative actions. And yet, they could not get over the fact that a radical Republican was president. Pointing to South Carolina particularly, Bagehot chastises them for their unstatesmanlike attitudes towards Northern politicians, claiming that even the French and the British would not use such disparages towards each other. Considering their economic dependency on the North, they would be taking a huge risk that was just not worth it in Bagehot's eyes. But the North, on the other hand, had virtually no risk at all, considering their industry and economic stability, which, as Bagehot points out, makes their lack of action even more frustrating. They felt that they were vastly superior to the Southern states in intelligence, in wealth, in enterprise, in population, that their energies were greater, their reputations higher, and their cause was nobler. And yet in every political contest, they would succumb and compromise. Overall, Bagehot seemed to consider the South swept up in a secession based on prideful stubbornness, and the North, for all their claims of morality and equality, were largely kowtowing to the whim of a barbaric group of states. Now, certainly this was not how the South viewed themselves, and nor did the North. But what Bagehot did have in common with the Americans was the understanding that this war would be a watershed moment in history, saying of the conflict, "Nothing that passes beyond our own shore can affect us so powerfully or concern us so much as the proceedings and conditions of the great federal republic." Bagehot's feelings, however, were not consistently anti-South from beginning to end, as he had earlier wrote of the North that unstatesmanlike anger against the slave states marks the tone of debates in Congress. These comments and more would lead one to believe that Bagehot was initially somewhat pro-South. But then, as the war began, it seemed that his opinions evolved. writing in 1861 of Southern leaders, "The blood which has at length begun to flow must be upon them and their children. They originated the quarrel by their passionate desire to extend the shameful institution that they are so proud." And it becomes even more clear that his mind shifted when the war concluded. As later on, economist writer James Grant would say of Bagehot, he repeatedly predicted that the South would win the American Civil War, in part because the North was led by an incompetent country lawyer, and then effortlessly transformed himself into a fan of Abraham Lincoln's as the Union won. By understanding how this British economist saw the war, we are afforded a more sterile view than that of other thinkers, especially within the United States. It helps us understand that even if we put emotions and morality aside, it was still a bad idea for the South to attempt secession.